The president of Zimbabwe wants the global ivory trade ban to be lifted. This is in an effort to sell over 8.5 billion rands worth of piled up tusks. Emmerson Mnangagwa says this will help the Zimbabwean economy. Botswana recently went ahead with the controversial move, but what does it mean in the long term? To discuss this further, we're joined from Nairobi, Kenya by Wildlife Practice Policy Manager Colin O'Credian. Thank you so much for your time. Let's start by that very question. What exactly would lifting the ban on the ivory trade in Zimbabwe mean in the long term? Does it really pose positively for the economy?
Well, that's a very good question because, in fact, the claim that it would benefit the economy is based on a number of assumptions, and probably the first assumption that it's based on is that there are willing buyers and credible buyers out there who want to buy this ivory. Now, Zimbabwe and the other southern African countries twice in the last couple of decades have participated in one-off sales of accumulated ivory stockpiles. On the first occasion, Japan was the only buyer, so it was effectively a cartel, and the selling countries got a very poor price. On the second occasion in 2008, China joined Japan as a buyer, but again, the two buying countries cooperated to put the price down, and again, it wasn't very satisfactory from a price point of view. It was still money into the economy, but our feeling is that in the present context, Zimbabwe's expectations for a huge windfall are really inflated or overestimated. And of course, in the meantime, China has banned domestic trade in ivory, so they're unlikely to be interested in purchasing ivory this time around. That leaves, again, Japan as the only country in the last 3 decades other than China that has ever expressed any interest in being a buyer for ivory horn. And again, where they're the sole market and where demand in Japan is much lower than it used to be, we would anticipate that the price payable would be extremely low, and that unfortunately, as I say, Zimbabwe's expectations are too high.
Yeah, very high indeed. And I mean, if they're unable to sell at the price that you've just mentioned in terms of selling to the likes of Japan, what do they do with the stockpile? I mean, it's quite a significant stockpile that they mentioned there, 8.5 billion rands worth of tusks at their disposal.
Yeah, what they actually do with the stockpile is a sensitive issue. I mean, we do appreciate that, and everything we've said is against a background where we understand Zimbabwe's plight, and we do understand that, relatively speaking, including compared even to some countries that are ideologically opposed to ivory trade at all, they are making a relatively good job of managing their elephants. So, of course, what some countries have done is to destroy stockpiles as they accumulate, and to do this in a very public fashion. There are some pros and cons for that. One of the cons being that it actually increases the scarcity perception of ivory and can push up demand. But we also understand that for some countries, like the southern African countries, the populace view this as an asset, and that it would really be quite insensitive to the feelings of local people to destroy a stockpile in these situations. It's quite a difficult thing to do, even if you have to manage their expectations that they're not necessarily going to get very much money out of it. Of course, if it's not to be destroyed, then it has to be secured. It can't be allowed to leak into international trade either. That would be even less preferable. So it is rather a lose-lose situation, I'm afraid.
And I mean, it's interesting that I've just mentioned earlier that Botswana recently lifted a ban. And I just want to get a sense of you, the lifting of the ban on ivory trade, what does it do for poaching? Does it increase poaching? What are the risks that are associated here, apart from the perceived pros by the governments?
Well, what Botswana actually did was to lift a ban on hunting that they had imposed about 4 years ago. They're not in a position unilaterally to lift a ban on ivory trade, because that's something that has to be decided by the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And they will meet next month to consider Zimbabwe's application. Botswana has a similar application. Our view, there are differing views about how this affects the dynamics with elephant populations and poaching. And certainly in the past, when there were ivory sales, advocates for the sales said it would push down the price, it would remove the incentive for poachers. That clearly didn't happen. The evidence that it actually pushed up poaching is limited as well. But certainly in a situation where you have ivory trade to a country that's not able to manage its internal markets very well and not have adequate chain of custody, then you are going to have a situation where there's a risk of laundering of illegal ivory, and that could push up poaching. And we don't think that there is a credible market in the world at the moment, a country that wants to buy ivory and that has the capacity to manage that market at the same time as things stand.
So just a final thought, just your thoughts in terms of the application process that's been submitted by Zimbabwe. What is the likelihood that they'd get the approval?
They had a similar application in 2016 when the convention met in South Africa, and they were unsuccessful then. They fell well short of the two-thirds majority of voting governments that they would have needed. And it's not with any joy that I would expect that they aren't any more likely to be successful this time.
Been speaking there to Wildlife Practice Policy Manager Coleman O'Creadine. Now, a school in Sierra Leone is defiantly allowing pregnant girls to attend classes despite a law banning this. The legislation was passed in 2015. 15-year-old Meriti Sese is one of those affected. She fell pregnant at the age of 14. Despite the ban and threats from classmates, she is attending school.
15-year-old Mariatu Sese never thought she'd have to give up her right to an education. But a law in her native Sierra Leone bans pregnant girls from attending school. So when she fell pregnant at 14 with her daughter, life became tough. But Sese defied the ban and carried on going to class, despite the law and taunts from her classmates.
For going to school, the called change this ban also. For me, girl picking get belly now, you know get belly, making go to school because education is very, very important.
Now, in the home year, moved by her resolve, school principal Eric Conte decided to support her, risking his career and becoming an unwitting figurehead in the fight against a law many see as outdated. So far, his school is the only one in Sierra Leone known to be allowing pregnant girls.
Because of the persistence of that girl coming to school, whether the committee disturb her or not, coming to school continuously, so I have that passion, I have that feeling that this girl should not go away.
Africa has the highest adolescent pregnancy rates in the world, and 18 African countries require pregnant girls to drop out. The ban in Sierra Leone was adopted in 2015 when teenage pregnancies rose amid the chaos of a massive Ebola outbreak and in part due to a surge in rape. Women's rights group Equality Now filed a challenge to the ban last year, and a ruling is expected in November. The government says allowing pregnant girls to attend regular schools would tire them out and encourage others to have babies. It's created part-time centres where they can study. But for this pregnant 14-year-old girl in Freetown, who was kicked out of school and her parents' home, an overturn of the ban is the only solution.
Me and my boyfriend will say, not all papers to get pregnant, that me for say, in London. London education and not for an drop out.
When we return, a local artist is using her craft to promote the rights of LGBTQI community. More on that in just a moment.